With WWDC 2023, you have now an alternative for Core Data, which is SwiftData. And I wanted to test how good SwiftData is, what are the advantages, what are missing features, and what's not so good. I converted a Core Data project that is fairly complex to SwiftData. And now I want to share with you what I learned from this experience. I will try not to make it too much of a rant because I have quite a few problems with SwiftData. And in order to help you understand the difference between them, I have here the same project, one time with Core Data on the right, this is the old way, and on the left with SwiftData. And I will try to make this as comparable as possible. So by the end of this discussion, you will hopefully have a good idea of what it means to work with SwiftData versus Core Data, so that you can make a decision of maybe you have an existing Core Data project and you want to know if you should move to SwiftData or you want to build a new app and thinking of using SwiftData. Okay, now let's get started with the first question, which is what is SwiftData actually? A lot of people think it's a wrapper around Core Data, and I think Apple did not really communicate this well. So from what I understand from the presentations and also from the Slack conversations, SwiftData is not built on top of Core Data. It's a separate framework, which is built for Swift, so we can use our native types and SwiftUI. Whereas Core Data has been around quite a long time, and you have to deal with a visual editor for your models, and you have to deal with old Objective-C types like NSSet, NSNumbers, and SwiftData is just supposed to make a lot of the things easier that people were complaining about Core Data. On the other hand, Apple used a lot of the same technologies that they use for Core Data for storing and working with the SQLite database. They said they basically took what is working well and also used it for SwiftData. Because they took so much from Core Data, it can feel sometimes like you're still working with Core Data. The good thing about this is that a lot of the learnings you have from Core Data, you can directly transfer to SwiftData. This is a little comparison between the tools you use with Core Data and SwiftData. For example, we have an NS persistent container in Core Data, and very similar working for SwiftData, we used a model container. We have NS managed object models, persistent models, we have the object context, which becomes the model context, NS predicates, now we have predicate macros. This is another advantage of writing your filters in Swift code instead of strings. That looks very promising because you can write directly in Swift, and it's type safe. There's a lot of problems with this, but it's promising. We don't have a coordinator, we don't work with this XData modeled file anymore. And I guess this is the file that most people want to get rid of. So you have this. So the SwiftData and Core Data stacks are very similar. And you also see this from how we set up the project, where we have to work with a NS persistent container, and we get the context, the view context from this. SwiftData works very similar. They added more convenience for working with SwiftUI. For example, this model container modifier, which automatically sets up this container for the schema. The schema is transferred instead of, for Core Data, you have to give the file name of the XDD data modeled file. And for SwiftData, you tell which of the modeled files should be in the database, like here my snippet. That's very convenient. You can also work with the model container and ask for the main context. Again, it's very similar. And this makes it also easier to transfer. You can use a public and shared database with Core Data, whereas for SwiftData, you only get the private one. If you want to transfer an existing Core Data project, there's an easy way of creating the schema files. If you open your XDD data modeled file and go to editor, create SwiftData code, it is going to generate you this model files. So for example, this is my snippet class. SwiftData works with classes. Also Core Data works with classes. And the only thing you have to actually do here is this add modeled macro, which automatically then generates the actual schema. They rely heavily on these macros. For example, I have here an attribute for renaming things or setting something to external storage. and also relationship rules with the relationship attribute. This is quite convenient. And one problem, so I had to, if I didn't set this as optional, it wouldn't build and give me problems. And the other thing is, especially if you want to use iCloud Sync, you need to use an array of optionals because all relationships need to be optional. I think this is quite annoying. The other thing with this relationships is here you have an array. In Core Data, this is in a set, it's a set, unless you still have the option in the schema to set here, for example, one folder has many snippets. You have here the possibility to set arrangement ordered for just a local Core Data stack. I didn't find any ordering for SwiftData. This looks like it's ordered, but it's not. And it's a little bit tricky because sometimes if you rebuild, it gives you a different order. It's just very confusing to have here an array type instead of a set, which means that every time you have this, you need to again sort it, and I don't really like to sort things again. Then I was interested in storing different types. I tried to store enums. This is working, only that it's not persistent, so the next time I'm launching, it's not, the enum value is not there anymore, and it crashes because it expects to have something. And the nice thing about SwiftData is that I don't need to specify here anything as optional. I can just say it is always there, non-optional. But if you try, if something's not correctly working, it will crash the whole application, like for using enums. Whereas if I just do manually things and handle my optionals myself, it's a little bit more safe. Yeah, so the enums would be useful if I just directly here could declare an enum and it saves it automatically, but this is still a problem. You can store your custom types and any other struct that is codable. This is working. Just makes it a lot easier. For example, here I defined a color data type with for values for red, green, blue, and opacity. That is codable. And then I can simply use this as one of my properties types. Declaring your types in your model files in code is quite convenient and very promising, but I had a lot of problems with enums and relationships. And also, this is coming back again when we talk about fetching things, because then it's giving me even more problems. So for example, when you use predicates, just so you know how this looks like. Here in my folder list, I have a folder type that I want to fetch. And similar to before where you had add fetch request, property wrapper, they now use add query. This is using macros now in some way. Other than the naming and a little bit the access point, they're very similar. But there's one problem where I cannot dynamically change here the predicates or the sorting. For example, I have here one view where I show the list of all tags that the user generated. And I have here a little toggle where you can switch between different sorting. This is currently not working. With Core Data, I use here a fetch request of fetching all. Then I have here the sorting style with a state property for my picker. And the way I'm updating this is by using onChanged for these properties and then setting the tags and the sort descriptors to the new one. Similar to when the search terms or search text in the text field changes. I'm generating the new NS predicate. And I'm setting this to my add fetch request NS predicate. So you can dynamically change the predicates in the sort descriptors with Core Data, whereas with SwiftData you cannot. One workaround that also works for Core Data that I used quite a lot when Core Data came out the first time for SwiftUI. You could also not dynamically change it, but there was a workaround, which is to pass all of your values in the initializer. Like here I have this sorting and the search term, and I pass this in the initializer for my tag list, the list that is shown here. And here in the initializer, I'm creating a new query with this filter. I'm just going to uncomment this so you can read this better and see one example of how to write a predicate with the new styling. I was creating a new query with filter, generating a predicate where you can define how to filter. For example, in the tags name should contain the search term. This is written in Swift instead of the NS predicate string styling, so quite a nice new addition. Also with the sorting here, every time one of these values of sorting or searching changes, my initializer would be executed, and I would change here my add query customization, and then my list would update. Now this is not working anymore, and it just hangs the whole app. Apparently they changed the way add query works with the new Swift macro. Let's see if this is working again. This is a big feature for me that is required for something like SwiftData or Core Data. You have a very complicated database with a lot of data, and you want to... Why would you use SwiftData or Core Data for something that is so simple that you don't need search? Most people at some point you want to have search. And right now I cannot dynamically do this searching here, updating this. Now for Core Data, very easy, super straightforward. And for SwiftData, I just cannot make it work in a nice way. I also had a look at the official demo projects for SwiftData, and this is the sample trips app here. Let's see if the preview for this is working. Okay, it's not. Yeah, this is another topic we have to discuss. So here, basically, they do the same. They have a search text with a searchable where they want to update their buckets, or they just want to show a list of bucket list items. And you see here they use a for each with filtered bucket lists. With this in this list. And what they do is, if the search text field is empty, then they return the trips all of the bucket list items. Otherwise, they generate here a fetch request, fetch descriptor with a predicate. Again, another example for this add predicate macro, where you can say the item's title contains the search text field, and the trips names, items trip is equal to the trips name. It's quite a complicated filter. But the way they execute is not over this add query. They use the model context fetch and return this newly fetched result, which is then used in this list. Now, this is updated if any of the state properties that is used here changes. For example, if my search text changes, this is updated. But this is not updated if you're searching and you add a new item for this list. If one of these items changes, it is updating because of the new observation framework, but this is not a standing query like add query or add fetch request. I want to have life as easy as possible, and I don't want to think of all the edge cases. I wanted to just have the newest, freshest data all the time without me thinking about this with a standing query. So yeah, this is working, but I can see myself in the future, I can see you in the future being very frustrated with having a bug related to this not so ideal implementation. Okay, let's have a look at another example. This is from a tutorial from Tunde, and he's doing the filtering. It's a to-do app, so we have here a list of all the items in the filtered array, and the way he's doing it, he has an add query for all the items, and he does the filtering on this array. So this is an array operation. Okay, this just gives me, because it's bad practice in terms for a small demo project with a few items, it's probably okay. But for a large app with thousands and thousands of elements, this is going to be a performance issue. The thing is, you don't want to do the sorting and filtering as an array operation. This is inefficient. You want to do it on the database level. Filtering in the database, that's why we have this kind of relationship database, to make this kind of operations more efficient. And it is unfortunately one of the best solutions in terms of the user sees their results properly, but it's not a good practice. It is unfortunately the solution that is actually working, but not the way you would want to, and in the long run this might be an issue. I'm not even sure if you would, for example, want to have a portfolio project and you use SwiftData and use this solution, if the people would actually, what kind of feedback you get. Because if I see this, I'm like, you did not really understand one point of using Core Data or SwiftData, and then you're getting worse points just because you did not have any other proper implementation options. Other than not being able to change this add query dynamically. Sometimes it simply doesn't work correctly. So one of the known issues is that it's not even updating it, refreshing it, giving the newest data here sometimes. This is a requirement, but it's having a problem. I also had some tests. Okay, so for example, you can say if you have an if's favorite property, you can filter this by is favorite. This is working, or you can search for certain string values in there the title contains. When you have optionals, like here I have an image data blob optional, this is not working correctly. Every time you are working with optionals in the predicates, especially with relationships, you might as well forget it because it's always crashing. Then there are also some known issues with dates. For example, I want to show the older snippets in a section that means that the ones that I generated before today. This was just a test. And somehow this time it works when I set the predicate in the initializer. Maybe it's just a miracle and it's going to change again. So I can filter by the date. There are some known issues with predicates for date, UUID, and URL. Sometimes that types that I would expect to work properly, but there's issues with them. Luckily in this example, it actually works. Okay, my preview is crashing again, but as you see, there's a big problem with the add query. One of the things I actually like is the fact that SwiftData works with the new observation framework for easier, more effective data flow. For example, in my detail view, when I have here a snippet instance that I want to edit, I can simply use the new add bindable property wrapper and then get here, for example, a selection to an enum, a binding to an enum value. This is quite useful. And one discussion that always comes up with this, also with core data, is if you can use MVVM. And I think a lot of people would have preferred an easy way to store Swift data objects in view models. You can partially do this thanks to this new observation feature. I'm just going to shortly highlight this. For example, you would want to have a snippet view model. And in this case, you can use the new observable, which means that you can store here something like snippets and then maybe add here a fetch function to fetch this actually from the model context. This is not ideal and I don't think they want us to do this. It's more meant to work with this add query. You can, with some limitations, store them in this view model. For example, now if you use this and one of these snippets properties changes, the views will actually get notified and also update. The main problem is I need to actually, if you want to query something, you can't do this properly from the view model. You don't have a standing query. So if you want to have an array of certain objects, if one of them is added or deleted, you won't have any information about this. In contrast to core data, where you can at least use an NS fetch results controller to get notified when something is inserted or deleted. But it's basically still not, SwiftData or core data really don't work very well with MVVM. Unfortunately, if for people who want to have a separation and just easily change the storage solution, you can't do this. You need to manually do this in all these views. But as you saw, you can place some objects in a view model with this add observable macro. And the whole data flow now gets a little bit more efficient than before with core data and this SwiftUI updating cycle. So this is a good new thing. Another thing is that they also made SwiftData directly work with Swift concurrency. In most cases, this is good. I never really got into async await much. The one thing that makes problems is with the previews. And it's frustrating to get a new framework that is meant to be work that is built for SwiftUI in mind that has such a big problem with previews. It's a little bit like they run out of time and just, oh shit, there was previews, we didn't think of this one. I do have here previews working. And let me just show you 2 examples for previews. So for example here, I use the folder list view. This is an add query. We should go there. Here this uses a query. Add query needs a container or a model context in the environment, which means you need to also add this model container to the preview. And let's just go to the sample they provided. And this is working with async and rate, and it needs to run on the main actor, which you then have to add here that assume isolated. Again, I don't really know what this means. It's actually a problem with the preview macro and the way this is working. If you use the old preview provider, you don't need to think about this. It works just like that. This preview sample data here, you can configure an in-memory one and then add some sample data. You saw I had one folder in there in my preview. You definitely want to have some data in your previews, otherwise it's really frustrating and a lot of the times not very useful to work with the previews. Then the second problem is, for example, here in this folder editor view, I have an instance of a folder that I want to just change the name. You see here, I don't use any property wrapper, I just pass this observable. And if you would now think, I just create a new folder and pass this. For example, here, I attach to my folder instance a static function that generates me a new folder. This is just pre-populating the data, and with SwiftData, when you create an entity, you don't directly need to insert it into the context. You can do this afterwards. However, this is going to crash your previews. Maybe just going to do, and it's very annoying because now it gives me your app quit unexpectedly. Thank you. And the error is failed to find currently active container for folder. So this is for, as I said, I created an object that is not connected to a container or a context, which it doesn't like. Which then means that you need to insert it into the context. And I thought, you just inserted it, but you need to hold a strong reference to the container, otherwise this is... And some part of the concurrency features means that it's called in a weird way and it still doesn't accept it. So no matter if I insert this, it doesn't really like it. Which brings us to so first I need to actually here have a container with some sample data. And in this case, I'm using this preview folder editor view, so this one where I am fetching all the entities and then I just use the first one in this array. So this is a very stupid approach, but unfortunately it's the only one that works. You can make this a little bit more reusable. I'm going to attach a video where I talk about this approach, but it really feels way too difficult. And it's like they really haven't thought this through as a unfortunately unsolved problem, right? Which seems to be connected to the concurrency features. Okay, now after this unpleasant one, let's talk about a pleasant thing with SwiftData. You get autosave. In Core Data, you need to constantly call context.save. SwiftData does that automatically when one of your views updates. For example, when I change the name of my folder, this view would update and call save. So you don't need to think of this constantly, and the user's data is quite safe. This feature is automatically working. You can also disable this by configuring the container. When you create this here, you can also say to don't autosave. Then a couple of more mentions of other missing features. I did mention quite a few problems, and I just want to fill in some of the gaps to make this as complete as possible. So you don't get section queries. So for example, if you have the list of items ordered by timestamps, with section queries, you can say in which day you want to have section them by day. Or if you have certain categories, maybe your favorites and your non-favorites. This is not supported with SwiftData, although you can obviously create a separate add query for each of them. Then you don't have support for UI kit. I already mentioned you don't have NSFetch results controller, no equivalent to this, which you would need, for example, for working with a UI table view or UI collection view. They said you can use Core Data and SwiftData in the same project, but this means you need to define your models twice, and this seems to be just way too much and too much of a hassle and cause for problems. I really don't like they didn't think of UI kit. And now they only said, let's just skip UI kit. Who cares about UI kit? Just do SwiftUI. Yeah, then I already touched a little bit that MVVM is not meant for this. From the limits and problems, this is mostly for me related to querying and the preview not working properly. I see mostly problems with the data models and the add query that don't really work for also with relationships. And I really want to have the queries working properly. Otherwise, I don't really see an application that can... I don't really see a lot of applications that can live without dynamic queries. And, well, it's not just the dynamic, it's a lot of them don't work properly. And or some of the types don't work at all, like UUID and date and URL. There's quite a few things that I consider as basics and just to make it usable for a basic application. Then one of the limitations you also need to keep in mind is that it only supports the newer iOS version of iOS 17, macOS 14, and so on. As a wrap-up, I only showed you what I found so far, what is a problem. It's more interesting to see how far they can go during the beta phase until they release iOS 17. And if I look at the timeline of, they introduced this in the beginning of June, and now we have the beginning of August when I record this, so we have 2 months where they had time to improve it, and from the release notes, the list just got longer, and I see more workarounds. I really don't like workarounds because it means it's going to change in the future. It's unreliable and unpredictable. At this point, I would have expected a lot more progress, and I'm just guessing that they introduced too much during WWDC 2023, and maybe it's because they focus more on Vision Pro to push this platform a lot more, so they put more effort into this, which might then cause problems for SwiftData that just doesn't get enough attention during this beta phase. And then the thing is, if they don't fix it until the public release, you're going to be stuck with all these problems for the next year. And I don't really see how they can finish it in the next 2 months, because there's just too much problems. This is just my personal opinion, and my prediction is this is probably not going to be nearly enough for basic app even to use it in production. And I would just right now not use it at all if you can. Just use Core Data, because the idea of having SwiftData that helps you, makes it easier to build apps with, for example, writing your model files in code in Swift types. All these advantages don't mean a lot if half of the things don't work, and then the time savings you have in the beginning, you're going to waste on bugs and frustration. The current state feels very much like SwiftUI in the first iteration, where it also changed and it also causes a lot of trouble and frustration. So I'd rather advise you not to go for it and save yourself some headaches. I know I'm a YouTuber and I should always be super enthusiastic about new things, but I don't really see it to be that much of fun. Maybe in a month things change. I will constantly have a look at the updates, but there's still so much missing and so much bugs, I really cannot recommend it. And even if you don't like some of the things Core Data does, it is working, it is proven. There's a lot of documentation on it and a lot of resources. Probably for each of the annoyances that you find, there is a solution already available. And personally, I found once I get a hang of some of these strategies, how to deal with optionals, so you don't have to write optional code in your SwiftUI views. Once you know about the initializers and the life cycles, how to set things up, how to find certain settings. Once you know this, it's pretty straightforward and very easy to build up on top. Maybe if you want to build a small portfolio app and just test new things, you can try it, but definitely nothing that you want to use in production. Since Core Data is not broken, I would only move away from Core Data to SwiftData when it's an actual improvement, and right now I don't see it. It's not there yet. I am hoping for iOS 18 to be really the year where SwiftData can be used because it has a lot of potential. It's a step in the right direction. Let me know in the comments how you so far see SwiftData. If you would use it, what problems do you have? If you have anything that I can provide you with, since I spent quite a bit of time testing it. Don't forget to like this video if you found it helpful and share it. Until next time, happy coding.